this morning.
Our reading today is from Genesis 16, 1 through 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, so that it may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, his husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt upon her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress, Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said to him, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Beer-lahai-roi. It lays between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Jackie. What we've been up to this spring so far is we have been, during this portion of our worship service, looking at the life of Abraham, found in these early chapters in the book of Genesis. And this morning's passage is, it's a bit of a detour. It's not really about Abraham. It involves Abraham, but he's not the focus of it. The focus is this female Egyptian servant named Hagar. And if you were paying attention to when Jackie read this passage, this is a pretty horrific story. Because this story involves slavery, it involves polygamy, it involves domestic violence, it involves the mistreatment of women. You can hear a story like this and think, see, this is why I don't believe in the Bible. This is why I can't believe in the Bible. Because how can any decent person be okay with this? And that's a very fair thing to say. And here's what I'd say in response, just quickly before we get into it, is there is a big difference between description and prescription. There's a big difference between just describing what happened versus prescribing what should happen. And so in the same way where when you check the news and you read a particular news outlet, if they're reporting on something terrible happening, that's not necessarily them endorsing that terrible thing happening. They're just reporting the facts. So just the fact that these horrible things are in this story does not mean that the Bible's okay with it. In fact, the Bible in so many other places points and says these are terrible things. And scholars point out a lot of the relational difficulty that you see in this story is largely a result of these horrible institutions that and things that were done to each other in this story. So don't make the mistake of just assuming that it's in the Bible means that the Bible is cool with it. But I'll also say this, because even though this is a hard story and there's hard cultural realities that you have to kind of push through to get into it, this story is also really beautiful. And for me personally, I don't know if there has been a story or a passage in the Bible that has been more meaningful to me in the past year of my life than this story. I continue to go back to this, continue to go back to Hagar, and I think there's a lot of comfort here for us if we're willing to enter into it, even though it's hard. Hagar does something in this story that no one else in the entire Bible does, which is pretty wild. She names God. There's all these examples throughout the Bible where God's telling us his name and people naming things in relation to God, naming a well or naming a place or naming whatever, but this is the only time in the whole Bible where someone looks at God and says, this is your name. And she says this in verse 13. She calls him the God of seeing, which in Hebrew, it's these two words in Hebrew, El Roy, which I realize sounds kind of Appalachian, but in Hebrew, El Roy means the God who sees me. And if this is the only time that this happens in the Bible, I think it's worth our time to pause and say, what in the world does that mean? Why is that so significant? What does it mean for God to be the God who sees us? And there's a lot that we can say, but three answers to that question that I want to draw out from this passage would be this. What does it mean that God sees us? First, it means that he honors our humanity. Secondly, it means that he empathizes with our sorrow. And thirdly, it means that he transforms our story. So that's what it means. What does it mean? God, you're the one who sees me. It means that he honors our humanity, he empathizes with our sorrow, he transforms our story. Let's look at these one at a time. What's the first one mean? Of him honoring our humanity. And to make sense of that and to make sense of this story, let's just walk through the details of it real quick, because otherwise we won't have our bearings. So here's what's going on. A few chapters before this, in Genesis chapter 12, God comes totally unprovoked to this guy named Abram. And even though Abram he was 75 years old at the time, his wife was said that she was barren, couldn't have children. God says, even though all of those circumstantial factors, I'm going to give you a child. In fact, I'm going to give you so many children, you won't even be able to count them all. It's like, whoa, that's amazing. That was Genesis chapter 12. Here we are, Genesis 16. That was 10 years ago. And you think 10 years of waiting, no movement, no child, no progress. Even though God made these big promises, it doesn't seem like he's doing anything. In fact, we looked at this passage last week. God does this dramatic reassurance of Abraham. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. 10 years is a long time to wait. So his wife, Sarah, or Sarai, she starts thinking of loopholes. And so she comes to Abram with this idea in verse 2. She says, hey, I've got this Egyptian servant named Hagar. Why don't you impregnate her, and then her child will become our child? And you think, okay, what level of desperation would you have to be at to authorize this, to just even come up with this idea? I'm going to give my husband away because we are so desperate for a child. And she does, and Abraham doesn't push back against this plan. And then look at this language in verse 3. A lot of scholars point out this language for lots of different reasons, but it says that Sarai took Hagar and gave her to Abram. This is the language of property. This is coercion. I am just going to take you and give you to my husband. And we do not know if Hagar consented to this arrangement or not. She has no power in the situation, no voice. She is just at the mercy of these two. And the plan works. Abraham sleeps with her. She gets pregnant. And when she is pregnant, it says in verse 4 that Hagar starts to look with contempt on her mistress, on Sarai. That word means to look down on. And we don't really know exactly what that means or why or what's going on. Maybe she just feels superior of like, okay, I've got what it takes as a woman, you do not. That makes me feel superior to you. Maybe she felt so violated by this act of coercion that she felt like, oh, God gave me a baby. I feel vindicated for the abuse that I've endured from you. Whatever the reason is, she's mistreating Sarai, looking down on Sarai, and Sarai, this turns up the volume on the humiliation she already feels. She feels jealous, she's angry, and so she goes to her husband, Abram, and is basically like, she's the worst. This is terrible. And in verse 6, Abram basically looks at her and says, hey, not my problem. She's your servant. Do whatever you want to her. And Sarai does. It says in verse 6 that she, quote, dealt harshly with her. Now that kind of feels sanitized to our ears, but that same word that is in the Hebrew that gets translated dealt harshly, that's the same word that gets used in the book of Exodus, referring to how the Egyptians treated the Israelite slaves, meaning they physically beat them, they assaulted them, they were violent towards them. That's the word. That's what Sarai is doing to her servant. She is being violent and physical and abusive towards her. And it's so bad that Hagar, it says that she flees. She runs for her life. She runs into the wilderness, trying to get putting as many miles as she can between her and this dysfunctional, toxic, abusive, terrible situation. And if you just hit pause on the story here, she's traveled for, scholars say, maybe up to a week, 10 days, based off of her location, how far away she is from everything. She has no resources to her name. She is pregnant. She has been violated and used and abused and rejected and minimized, and she has been discarded. She's a single mother. She's alone, and she's in the middle of a Middle Eastern, barren wasteland. She stops at this spring of water, and it's in that moment of her life where she encounters the Lord. Look at what happens in verse 7. It says that the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness. Now, the angel of the Lord is this mysterious, unique way that the Lord reveals himself throughout the Hebrew scriptures. So the Lord shows up to her, and what is the first thing he says? Don't miss the importance of this. Verse 8, he said, Hagar. Did you notice that throughout this whole story, no one speaks to her or about her by her name? In verse 2, Sarai calls her my servant. Verse 5, my servant. Verse 6, Abram calls her your servant. Abram and Sarai see her as a possession. They see her as an object that they can use, discard, exploit at their whims. No one in this story sees her, and yet the Lord does. No one even refers to her as a human being, and the Lord honors her humanity. He knows her name. He notices her. He knows her. He speaks her. He is pouring dignity, value. He is affirming the reality that she matters. And what would it have been like to have been named by someone like this in this part of her story? This reminds me of this scene from the show Parks and Rec, where Leslie Knope, who's played by Amy Poehler, this high-strung, really funny character, her crush, her kind of celebrity crush is Joe Biden, who is not just her political hero and her idol, but this is 10 years ago, so Grandpa Joe was still old 10 years ago, and she thinks he's gorgeous. And so her husband in the show, Leslie Knope's husband, arranges this surprise gift where he has worked an opportunity for her to get to meet her idol, her hero. And she doesn't know it, and they're walking into this conference room, and she walks in there's Joe Biden. And she, Amy Poehler's face, you just see her like smile and freaking out, and she's hyperventilating, she's stammering because she's in the presence of greatness. And he walks towards her and says, "You must be Leslie." And she just starts maniacally laughing. and she kind of stammers out what's going on inside of her. She says, "My name just came out of your mouth." And there's this moment where she is capturing the thrill of what it is like when someone in your eyes who is important and praiseworthy, that they know you. Someone so beyond you, someone so infinitely amazing, they know your name. She just can't even speak straight. The Lord of the universe, this passage is saying that he is the one of infinite importance. He is the only one that is ultimately praiseworthy. He's the celebrity of all celebrities. He's the King of kings, and he knows your name. And he notices you and regards you, that you are on his radar. You matter to him. And I wish in some ways we could just linger over this reality for our whole time. We'll linger for a moment, but then we got to move on. But if you just think about the banquet of comfort that is available to us with this reality. Because if you have ever thought, I don't have what it takes, I cannot live up to the expectations of my family or of the world, I don't have the amount of money the world says I need to have. I don't have the resume the world around me says I need to have. I don't have the beauty or the looks or the intelligence or the gifts that the world says that I need to have. I feel unimpressive and overlooked and unlovable and like I don't matter in the grand scheme of things. And if you have ever felt that, this passage is looking at you and saying, by the fact that God sees you and knows your name, you matter. He honors your humanity by knowing you, relating to you as a person of utmost significance, just because you're a person. Here's somebody without any credentials, anything impressive about her resume, doesn't matter. The Lord knows her, the Lord sees her. He honors our humanity. That's the first thing. Just by seeing us, that's what that means. But it gets better because he doesn't just honor our humanity by seeing us. This also means that he empathizes with our sorrow. He empathizes with it. When the Lord is talking with Hagar, here's what he says in verse 11. He says, "You are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction." The kid gets named Ishmael because the word Ishmael means the Lord hears. God hears. What is it that the Lord heard? He heard her weeping. He heard her crying. She is overwhelmed. She's at the end of her rope. She is burdened. She is experiencing all of this affliction. She's crying out, and the Lord hears her. That's what it means when it says that the Lord sees us. It's a way to say he doesn't just look upon our affliction indifferently or in this disconnected, numb way that we might kind of scroll through our phone. It moves him. It breaks his heart. He is not indifferent to the suffering and the weeping and the crying of people. He is filled with compassion. He empathizes. He feels with. In fact, there are all these places when you get to the New Testament that give you a really fascinating window into the center of Jesus' heart. Anytime he sees pain, it activates compassion inside of him. I'll give you a few examples. This is Luke chapter 7, verse 13. There's a story of a widow who is burying her only child. And that verse says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. Matthew chapter 9 says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless. Luke chapter 10, Jesus tells the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan, and the story is you've got this guy that's been robbed and beaten up, and he's left on the ground for dead, and there's this Samaritan, this Good Samaritan that comes along, which is the character in the story that kind of signifies who Jesus is. And it says, when he saw him, he had compassion. Luke chapter 15, the story of the parable of the prodigal son. You got this younger son that goes off and he blows up his life. And as he comes home, here's what happens. When the son was a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. That's who God is. That God is not indifferent to our suffering, but his heart breaks over it. That's what compassion means, to suffer with, to hurt with. You know, what blows Hagar away in this story is not the fact that she is given a son, that she's given these gifts. Those are awesome, but that's not what really blows her away. What blows her away is the fact that the Lord sees me. That's why she names him what she does in verse 13. That's why she names the little well, the spring where she's getting water in verse 14. She names it in Hebrew, Be'er Lahai Roy, which means in Hebrew, the well of the living one who sees me. She starts to realize every form of mistreatment from Abram, every kick or punch from Sarai, every moment where I have been rejected and minimized and betrayed and dehumanized, he has seen it all. He has seen it all, and it all matters to him. So here's the question for you. Do you know that this is how the Lord sees you? I mean, if you're anything like me, when you go through hard things, it's easy to just assume, God, if you're even there, you don't care about this. You're like way off in heaven somewhere. You're in some galaxy far, far away. You don't see me. You don't care about me. You've got a whole world to worry about. And this passage is looking at you and me and saying, thankfully, we are wrong. That the details of our lives matter. And he sees them, and he's not a stoic. It breaks him. He weeps over it. This last year, I listened to the stories of the Chronicles of Narnia whenever I was at the gym, which I realized when I said that this morning is weird. I don't know why that was my audio book choice, but I did. It was great. But there's this scene in one of the Chronicles of Narnia, the book The Magician's Nephew, that stood out to me. The story is about this little boy named Diggory, and he has this mother back home who is sick and bedridden, and she is dying. And Diggory meets Aslan, the great, almighty, wonderful lion. And he asks Aslan this question, or he says, please, please, won't you? Can't you give me something that will cure mother? And then here's what Lewis writes. I put it at the beginning of your bulletin if you want to follow along, or you can just listen. But here's what Lewis writes after this moment. He says, up till then, he, Diggory, had been looking at the lion's great feet and the huge claws on them. Now, in his despair, he looked up at its face, and what he saw surprised him as much as anything in his whole life. For the tawny face was bent down near his own, and wonder of wonders, great shining tears stood in the lion's eyes. They were such big, bright tears compared with Diggory's own, that for a moment he felt as if the lion must really be sorrier about his mother than he was himself. What do you think it would feel like to have somebody enter into your story in such a way where they are actually weeping over the same things you're weeping over, and maybe even weeping over it more than you are? I think it would feel validating to know, okay, I'm not crazy. This is a big deal. You see this. You feel this too. I think it would make me feel like I'm not alone. Like I don't just have to bear these burdens by myself, but you're here with me. You're bearing this with me. This is how the Lord responds to us in our pain and in our hurt. And as a pastor, I have the privilege of getting to hear some of your stories. I know some of the stories in this room. I don't know all of them, but I know enough to know that there is a lot of hurt in this room, out there and up here. And we all carry these wounds of loss. We carry the wounds of losing loved ones. We carry the wounds that have been inflicted on us by our family or by our parents or by our friends. We carry the wounds that we've inflicted ourselves through our own stupidity or regret or addictions or whatever. We carry the wounds of just going through life and experiencing infertility and cancer and strained marriages and strained friendships and on it, just the pile up. And I want you to know that the Lord of heaven and earth sees it all. I mean, we have this pressure in the South. I get it. We want to feel buttoned up. We don't want anybody to know about it. And so we hide and we only showcase our good parts. We hide all of that stuff. And it can just compound the pain because we just feel more and more alone in it. And many of us are alone. We're just silently, privately suffering. And the Lord sees it. Every moment of weeping, He has wept with you. He has seen it all. There has not been one moment of cry or of despair, of your feeling overwhelmed, that He has not been aware of and that He didn't weep over it as well. You're not alone. There's this line that I think about all the time that the Avett brothers sing in their song, "We Are Loved." It's an amazing song if you've heard it. It's the song about no matter how you showed up, if you're a coward or if you're courageous, it doesn't matter. We are loved by the Lord of the universe. And there's this one line as they're reflecting on, looking back over their life, he says, "I have felt alone, but I never have been." I have felt alone, but when I think about it, in all of those moments when I felt like I've been by myself, you have been with me. The Lord empathizes with our sorrow. He sees us. He grieves with us. He joins us in it. But it gets even better because when it says that the Lord sees us, it's not just that He honors our humanity. It's not just that He feels deeply over it. He actually does something. He transforms our story. That's the last thing. He doesn't just say, "Oh, I hate that you feel so bad, but too bad my hands are tied. I can't do anything." No, He does something. So let's look at how He transforms her story and our story. In verse 13, she calls Him the God of seeing. But then she explains what she means by that. And she says, "Truly here I have seen Him who looks after me." In other words, she's playing with that word of looking. He doesn't just look at me. He looks after me. He takes care of me. He moves towards me in my need. I mean, if you think about her life has been decimated. And the Lord shows up and just blesses her with this dump truck of goodness beyond anything that she could ever imagine. Look at verse 10. He gives her the same promise that He gave to Abraham. He said, "I will multiply your offspring so much so that they can't even be counted." This is the same wording, the same language. This is, in this particular cultural moment, it's like being told you just won the lottery. Children were everything in this culture. This is why not having a child or being barren was such a big deal. Children were your retirement plan. Children was your securities. Children was your workforce. Having children was everything. So to be told you're going to have so many kids beyond, you can't even count it. She didn't even have categories for this. And then listen to how her child in verse 12 is described. The one that she is pregnant with is described as a wild donkey of a man. Some of you have wild donkeys of boys out there as well. But here's what this means, that this child is going to be free roaming. He'll not be pinned up, shackled. And here's somebody who has been in servitude for maybe her entire life. And she just got a promise, your child will experience a freedom that you never got to taste. Here's what we see. God sees this woman for all that she is. Her poverty, her wounds, her need, and her pride, her cruelty, how she treated Sarai earlier up in the story. He sees all of her, the big, complicated, contradictory glob of a knot of a mess that she is. And he is not repelled by her. He does not disgusted by her. He moves towards her with compassion to bless her beyond her wildest imagination. Why? Is it because she is this moral, upstanding figure and he just wants to bless her for her good behavior? No. Is it because she just is such a sad little puppy dog in the story and his heart breaks for her and he wants to do something nice for somebody in need? No. Why does he do this? Because he loves her. And he loves her because he loves her. Not because of anything in her. He just loves her because he loves her. This reminds me of this old famous scene from this old pseudo-famous movie, The Fisher King. 1991, so some of you are like, I don't even know what you're talking about, but here's the story. This is Robin Williams, early 90s. He plays this troubled, grieving man who lives out on the streets, and he takes this, one of the other lead characters in the story, this female character, on a date. They go out to dinner, and she herself is really kind of insecure, and she has confidence issues. She's jaded towards men. She's got all these horrible experiences in the past. But they go out on a date, and he's walking her home. It's at night. It's in the middle of the city. They're walking down the sidewalk. And he's saying all these nice things to her. And here's what she says. She interrupts him and says, "That's a little old-fashioned. You don't have to say those things considering what it is we're about to do." And he's like, "What are we about to do?" And here's what she says. "Well, you'll want to come upstairs, and we will have a couple of drinks, and then you'll sleep over. And in the morning, you'll awake, and you'll be distant, and you won't be able to stay for breakfast. And we'll exchange phone numbers, and then you'll leave and never call. And I'll go to work, and I'll feel so good for that first hour. And then ever so slowly, I'll turn into a piece of dirt. And I don't even know why I'm putting myself through this." And he has this, pained look on his face as she's telling him this. And then she just starts running. She just runs down the street, running away from him. And he starts calling her name, calling after her. And then he starts running after her. And he eventually catches up with her and gets her attention. And here's what he says. "Listen, I'm not coming up to your apartment. That was never my intention. I don't want just one night. I have a confession I have to make to you. I am in love with you. Not just from tonight. I have known you for a long time. I know that you come home from work at noon every day. I know you stop and get that romance novel at the bookstore. I know that you get a jawbreaker before you go back into work. I know that you hate your job and you don't have many friends. I know sometimes you feel a little uncoordinated and you don't feel as wonderful as everybody else and feeling as alone and separate as you feel. I love you. I love you, and I think you're the greatest thing since Spice Racks. And I'll be knocked out several times if I can just have that first kiss. And I won't be distant, and I'll come back in the morning, and I'll call you if you let me." It's not as creepy as it sounds when he relays it. It's not as stalkery when he relays it. Because when she hears all of this, in the moment, she melts. And she reaches out and she touches his face and she says, "You're real, aren't you?" She is in utter disbelief that there is someone out there in the universe that would know her to the bottom and would still love her. That is how the Lord of the universe relates to you. All the things that you feel insecure about, all the regrets that you're carrying around, all the wounds that feel like they're just open and will never heal, all the things that you blame yourself for, all the things that you showed up with and just assume God is disgusted by this, God is disappointed in me and all this. He sees all of you and he loves you to the bottom. And he loves you still. And you hear that and you think, well, how can I know that is true? Because I don't have an angel of the Lord standing in front of me telling me this. How can I know this is true? And it's true. You don't. You have something better. You can look back on the cross. Because what the cross is this historical, loud, unmistakable declaration that out of infinite, heartbreaking compassion for you, Jesus came running after you. He comes running towards you and he says, God, I want you to take all of their junk, put it on me, their cruelty, their hatred, their injustice, all of it, put it on me. And he did, and Jesus was abused. And Jesus was physically beaten. And Jesus was rejected and minimized and dehumanized and discarded. And he's on the cross and he's bearing the weight of it all. And you know what he's doing? He's weeping. And he's crying out to God the Father. And you know what he receives? He receives silence. In just a few moments, we're going to sing the song, How Deep the Father's Love for Us. And the second verse of that song says, the Father turns his face away. On the cross, God diverts his eyes. Jesus loses the sight of the Father. Why? Because he's taken our place. He is being rejected and experiencing everything that you and I deserve so that we wouldn't have to. He loses the gaze of the Father so that we would never lose it. He is rejected so that the Father's face would always and forever be turned towards us. That's how you can know. You can look back on the cross and know all of these things that I feel, all of this yuck that I've brought to the table, all the damage that I have done and has been done to me, none of it threatens his love for me. None of it threatens his attention towards me. I'm on his radar. He knows my name. He loves me. He has moved towards me to do something about all of this mess. When you know that, when you can see the one who sees you, that's what transforms your story. You know, Hagar at the beginning of the story, she's in bondage, she's rejected, she's unnamed, she's unlovable, and at the end of the story, she is free. She knows that the one of infinite importance knows her name. She knows that she is loved. She knows that she is seen. All of the gifts that she has been given, children, security, a future, a legacy, wow, all that's amazing. And it pales in comparison to knowing that she is seen by the Lord of the universe. It transforms her life. See the one who sees you. Look upon the one who looks upon you and at infinite expense to himself loves you. And that will change you. Well, consider that an invitation. Let me pray. Father, I pray that you would give us eyes to see the one who sees us. And Father, I pray for those of us in the room that feel particularly overwhelmed and feel particularly at the end of their rope or trapped, that we would see that you see us and that it grieves you and it matters to you because we matter to you, and that you would give us a sense, even just a tablespoon of a drop of your love for us. Even that is enough to give our hearts hope and courage and fortitude, knowing that you see us. So give us eyes, give us faith, and help us to receive the one who so intimately loves us. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.